Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I needed a break from the incessant noise of city life and thought the solitude of nature would be the perfect escape. I found the cabin through a rental site. It was described as quaint and rustic, isolated enough to promise the peace I craved. The pictures showed a small wooden structure surrounded by thick forest and overlooking a serene lake. It looked perfect. I arrived in the early afternoon. The drive had been long, the last stretch winding through dense trees on a narrow dirt road. The cabin was exactly as advertised, maybe even more charming in person. I unpacked my things, set up my fishing gear, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area around the lake. The water was clear, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were those of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a sense of tranquility I hadn't experienced in years. As dusk settled, I made my way back to the cabin. I lit a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple dinner, and settled down with a book. Outside, the forest grew darker, and the chirping of crickets filled the air. I was miles away from the nearest town, completely alone. It felt both liberating and slightly unnerving. I went to bed early, eager to rise with the sun and spend the next day fishing. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I quickly drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I couldn't tell what had stirred me. The room was pitch black, the fire long since died down. I lay still, straining to hear any sound. That's when I noticed it, a faint tapping noise like fingers drumming on wood. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the front porch. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the tapping persisted. I debated whether to investigate or stay inside. My curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, I cautiously opened the front door. The tapping stopped immediately. I shone the flashlight around, but all I could see were trees and shadows. There was no sign of anyone. Feeling a bit foolish, I went back inside and locked the door. I convinced myself it was probably just a branch swaying in the breeze or some animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but it took a while before I could fully relax. The next day passed without incident. I spent it on the lake, fishing and enjoying the quiet. By evening, I had almost forgotten about the previous night's disturbance. But as night fell, a sense of unease crept over me. I locked the doors and windows, something I hadn't done the night before, and kept the iron poker within reach. Around midnight, I was jolted awake again by the same tapping noise. This time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. I listened intently, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight and the poker and went to the window. I strained my eyes, trying to penetrate the darkness outside. Suddenly, the tapping moved from the porch to the side of the cabin, right near the bedroom window. It was as if someone, or something, was circling the cabin, knocking on the walls. I could feel my palms sweating as I crept towards the door. This time, I flung it open quickly, hoping to catch whatever it was off guard. The tapping stopped immediately, and again, there was nothing but silence and darkness. I shone the flashlight around, but saw nothing unusual. I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. I went back inside, but I couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night, sitting in the living room with the flashlight and poker by my side, jumping at every creak and rustle. The following day, I considered cutting my trip short, but I stubbornly decided against it. I had come here to find peace, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. I tried to enjoy my day, but a nagging fear lingered in the back of my mind. By the time the sun set, I was on edge, dreading the night. This time, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room, the poker in my lap, waiting. Midnight came and went, and for a while it was quiet. I started to think maybe it was over, whatever it was. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, the tapping started again. This time, it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was primal, menacing. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The growling grew louder, coming from right outside the door. The tapping turned into a violent banging, as if something was trying to break in. My mind raced with terror. I didn't know what to do. I felt utterly helpless. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed my car keys and bolted out the back door, running as fast as I could to my car. The banging and growling followed me, growing more intense. I jumped into the car, started it, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. My heart pounded in my chest and my hands shook on the steering wheel. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached a small town miles away. I checked into the first motel I found and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. It took hours for me to calm down and fall asleep. The next morning, I contacted the owner of the cabin and told him what had happened. He seemed surprised and concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. I never went back to that cabin, and I've avoided isolated places ever since. The memory of those nights still haunts me, a chilling reminder of the unknown terrors that can lurk in the darkness. The summer after my sophomore year in college, my friends and I decided to rent a house by the beach for a week. We found a beautiful, old house on a quiet stretch of coast in South Carolina. It was large, with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and an expansive porch that overlooked the ocean. The rental listing described it as charming and full of character. It sounded perfect for a summer getaway. We arrived on a bright, sunny afternoon. The house looked even better in person, a picturesque relic of a bygone era. We spent the first day unpacking, exploring the house, and then headed down to the beach to swim and sunbathe. By the time the sun set, we were all in high spirits, excited for the week ahead. That night, after a barbecue on the porch, we settled into the living room with drinks and board games. The house felt cozy and welcoming, the sound of the waves crashing outside adding to the ambiance. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. My friends, Alex and Lisa, took the master bedroom on the second floor, while I opted for a smaller room on the first floor near the back of the house. I was exhausted from the day's activities and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. At first, I couldn't tell what had woken me. The room was dark, and the only sound was the gentle whoosh of the ocean. I rolled over, trying to go back to sleep, but that's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like someone slowly walking down the hallway outside my room. My heart started to race. I strained to listen, and the creaking continued, getting closer to my door. I sat up in bed, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was just the old house settling, or one of my friends up for a late-night snack. But the sound was too deliberate, too measured. It stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. After a few tense moments, I decided to get up and check. I tiptoed to the door and opened it, peering into the hallway. It was empty. I felt a mix of relief and unease. I was about to close the door when I noticed something odd. The floorboards near my door were wet, like someone had walked through with wet feet. A chill ran down my spine. I went back to bed, but barely slept, listening for any more sounds. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I mentioned the incident to Alex and Lisa over breakfast. They laughed it off, teasing me about being scared of an old house. I tried to laugh with them, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We spent the day on the beach, trying to put it out of my mind. That night, after another fun evening, we all went to bed. I made sure to lock my door this time, still feeling uneasy. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again, the slow, rhythmic creaking. My heart pounded as the sound approached my door. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was walking down the hallway. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the footsteps stopped outside my door. Then I heard a soft, rasping whisper. It sounded like my name, repeated over and over. David! David! I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to call out, to run, but I couldn't move. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I clutched the blanket, my knuckles white, trying to will the sound away. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a loud bang on my door. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The room was empty, but the fear was overwhelming. I grabbed a heavy book from the nightstand and approached the door. Taking a deep breath, I yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but the floor was wet again, with small puddles leading towards the back of the house. I followed them, my fear giving way to a desperate need to understand what was happening. The trail led to a door at the end of the hallway, one we hadn't bothered to explore yet. I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. The air was damp and musty, and a faint, salty smell wafted up. I hesitated, but then I heard the whisper again, faint but unmistakable, coming from the darkness below. Summoning all my courage, I started down the stairs, the book clutched tightly in my hand. The basement was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through a small, grimy window. The floor was damp, and there was a strange, oppressive atmosphere. I moved the flashlight beam around, and it landed on an old, wooden chest in the corner. The whispering grew louder as I approached it. With trembling hands, I opened the chest. Inside, I found a bundle of old, waterlogged clothes and a small, rusted locket. I picked up the locket and opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman. Her eyes seemed to stare right through me, a haunting sadness in her expression. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the stairs, panic rising in my chest. I could hear the whispering all around me now, a cacophony of voices, urgent and pleading. I raced up the stairs and burst into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, watching the first light of dawn creep over the horizon. When my friends woke up, I told them everything. They could see how shaken I was and didn't question my decision to leave immediately. We packed our things and left the house without looking back. I later did some research and found out that the house had a dark history. Decades ago, a woman had drowned in the ocean nearby, her body never found. Locals believed her spirit haunted the house, searching for something or someone. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that I'll never forget the fear I felt in that house, and the feeling that something or someone was trying to reach out from the other side. Two summers ago, I took a job as a counselor at a summer camp in the Adirondacks. It was my first time working at a camp, and I was excited about spending the summer outdoors, leading activities, and making new friends. The camp was set deep in the forest, far from any towns, with a large, clear lake at its center. The other counselors were friendly, and the kids seemed eager to have a good time. The camp had been around for decades, and some of the older counselors liked to share spooky stories about the place. They told tales of ghost sightings and strange noises in the woods at night. I laughed them off, thinking they were just trying to scare the new guy. My cabin was one of the oldest on the property, tucked away from the main camp area, close to the edge of the forest. It was small, with creaky wooden floors and narrow bunk beds. My co-counselor, Jake, and I shared the cabin with a group of 10-year-old boys. Despite the eerie stories, the first few weeks went by smoothly. We spent our days swimming, hiking, and playing games, and the nights were filled with campfire songs and s'mores. One night, about a month into the summer, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a faint whispering coming from outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, trying to make out the words. It sounded like someone was calling my name. I shook Jake awake, but by the time he groggily sat up, the whispering had stopped. He told me I was probably just dreaming and went back to sleep. The next night, the whispering started again. This time, I was sure I was awake. I got out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight cast long shadows across the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was definitely calling my name. Brian! Brian! I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I should wake Jake, but I was afraid of being laughed at again. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped out of the cabin. The air was cool and still, and the camp was eerily silent. I followed the sound of the whispering, which seemed to be coming from the woods. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting twisted shadows on the ground. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the whispering grew louder, guiding me further away from the camp. I began to feel uneasy, but my curiosity pushed me onward. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated shack, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The whispering was coming from inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn back, but I couldn't ignore the pull of the voices. I approached the shack, the wooden boards creaking under my feet. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, shining my flashlight inside. The interior was dark and musty, with broken furniture and cobwebs everywhere. As I stepped inside, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting around the room. There was no one there, but I could feel a presence, something unseen watching me. I called out, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the confined space. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was barely visible, more of a dark shape than a solid form. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure began to move towards me, gliding silently across the floor. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. Just as the figure reached me, I felt a sharp pain in my head, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the ground outside the shack, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. The first light of dawn was filtering through the trees, and the camp was beginning to stir in the distance. I felt disoriented and weak, my head throbbing. I struggled to my feet and stumbled back to the cabin. Jake was already up, looking concerned. He asked where I had been, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded ridiculous even to me. He frowned and said I must have had a nightmare and sleepwalked into the woods. I wanted to believe him, but the memory of the shadowy figure and the whispering voices was too vivid to dismiss. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept seeing glimpses of dark shapes out of the corner of my eye, and the whispering returned every night. I was constantly on edge, barely sleeping, and the other counselors began to notice. They tried to reassure me, saying the camp was perfectly safe, but I could see the worry in their eyes. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to leave. I packed my things quietly, not wanting to wake anyone, and slipped out of the cabin. As I walked through the camp, the whispering grew louder, more desperate. "Brian, don't go. Stay with us." I ignored the voices and kept walking, my heart racing. As I reached the edge of the camp, I glanced back and saw the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods watching me. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never returned to that camp. I later learned that the shack in the woods had once been the home of an old hermit who was rumored to have practiced dark rituals. He had disappeared mysteriously years ago, and some believed his spirit still haunted the forest. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that something evil lurked in those woods. Even now, the memory of that summer haunts me, a dark shadow that I can't escape.